This is Clueless and Curious. Today we're looking at Karl Marx, the original basement dweller, whose edgy ideas led to some of the most unspeakable evil in known human history. On a damp spring morning, May 5th, 1818, in the quiet town of Trier, Germany, a child was born who would one day unleash ideas that would drown the 20th century in blood. His name was Karl Marx. Marx grew up in the age of smoke and steel, famously called the Industrial Revolution, where factories were rising, traditions collapsing, and inequality was burning like fire in the streets. Amid this chaos, and amid this shift in human progress, Marx believed he'd uncovered the key to human suffering itself, the class struggle. As he famously noted in his Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." Those words eventually lit revolutions, toppled governments, and promised utopia. But here's the bitter truth. Those words came from an unemployed, sick loser. Not from a worker, not from a builder, not from a man of action, but from one unemployed, bitter intellectual who spent his entire life broke, sick, and living off the charity of his wealthy friend. Marx was a self-proclaimed prophet of the worker, ironically, who never actually worked. And yet, this one man's opinion would become the seed of one of the deadliest ideologies in human history, fueling regimes that murdered over 100 million people in the 20th century. Part 1. The Young Philosopher. Karl Heinrich Marx grew up in a German town that was, interestingly enough, part of the Roman Empire at one point. His family was considered middle class for the time. They lived quite comfortably, but not exactly wealthy. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer, and his mother, Henriette, came from a Dutch and Jewish family of rabbis. It's a super important detail because religion ran deep in this family. And for his father's own safety and social cohesion, and to preserve his career as a lawyer, he converted from Judaism to Lutheranism. This was Karl's first glimpse into the rigid society which he one day would seek to dismantle. This left a major impression on Karl, who grew up pointing out and living through the contradictions of the world: faith, skepticism, tradition, modernity, safety, and nonconformity. History says that Karl was a stubborn and restless teenager who spent his time reading everything from poetry to philosophy. His teachers at the time shared he was a passionate student who would constantly debate and argue, often to his own demise. By the time Karl headed off to university, he was well educated, but more than that, he was ambitious and angry at the societal norms forced upon him and others under the restrictive Prussian laws. He not only noticed injustices, but he felt as if it was his duty to call them out. When he attended university in Berlin, he dove in headfirst into dense philosophical topics and thinkers like George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a person who saw humans working towards a greater freedom. But for Marx, this was not enough. He had a fire in his heart, and he was ready to use philosophy to dismantle the poverty and inequality he saw within society. As he would write in his thesis on Feuerbach, Marx famously said, "Philosophers only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." To some, it may sound like a headstrong college student ready to enter the workforce. But for Marx, he was declaring war on the social norms and the foundations upon which modern society was built. It was in these very same classrooms, much like we see with students today, following these archaic ideas, where he was transitioning from a student to a revolutionary. Part 2. Journalism, Politics, and the Birth of Marxism. Upon graduating, Marx only ever dreamed of becoming a professor and joining academia. His only desire was to lecture about philosophy and perhaps even write one of his own books one day. He never actually pictured himself as a revolutionary, but his dreams of becoming an academic were shattered on arrival as the Prussian state, which at the time was a monarchy, was massively cracking down on intellectual freedom in the 1830s and 40s. One by one, professors showing any form of sympathy towards democracy, secularism, or any societal change were labeled as dangerous and were censored, fired, or even exiled entirely. The universities were a much-needed battleground of ideas, which the Prussian state instantly shut down. Marx studied under a man named Bruno Bauer, another philosopher who went to battle with religion and societal norms. Well, in 1842, Bruno Bauer was banned from ever teaching again, and due to his proximity to Bruno, Marx was blackballed from ever joining university due to his reputation as a political liability. Marx's dreams of being an academic were dead on arrival, and his last remaining option was journalism. If they wouldn't allow him in classrooms, he would leverage his pen and paper on his own, without their permission. In 1842, Marx became the editor of a radical newspaper called the reshaped. He poured himself into it, writing scathing attacks on censorship, on monarchy, on the plight of the working poor. His articles were fiery, biting, and relentless. He wasn't just criticizing policies, he was attacking the entire system on which he was brought up. Well, the Prussian authorities didn't take long to respond. Within a year, they shut the paper down completely, declaring it a threat and a liability to the stability of the state. Marx's pen had already made him too dangerous. So, Marx did what many radicals at the time did. He went into exile. First, he went to Paris, where he mixed with other revolutionaries, and into Brussels, and then eventually London. Each move was forced by pressure from a government who wanted nothing to do with his radical ideas. Karl Marx was a threat. It was in Paris, during his relentless exile, that Marx met a man who would become the most important figure in his life, Friedrich Engels. Engels was the son of a wealthy German industrialist, a factory heir who had seen the brutal lives of workers in Manchester, England. Much unlike Marx, Engels had a lot of money. And unlike most rich men of his era, Engels had a lot of guilt. He despised the exploitation that funded his family's wealth. He lived in guilt every day, and Marx was the band-aid to that. Marx had the theory, Engels had the resources. Together they became one of history's most unusual duos. Engels became Marx's collaborator, editor, and more importantly, his financial lifeline. For the rest of Marx's life, Engels paid the rent, bought the groceries, and kept him afloat. It's not an exaggeration to say, without Engels, there might not have ever been Marxism. Marx might have been the prophet, but Engels was the patron saint of paying his bills. They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and Engels thought he was just helping out a friend. He thought he was supporting this brilliant but just unlucky writer, giving him the freedom to finish his great work. What he didn't realize is that it was blood money, fueling an ideology that would go on to stain the earth with blood. Because without Engels, there is no Communist Manifesto. Without Engels, there is no Das Kapital. And without those books, there's no Lenin, no Stalin, no Mao, no Pol Pot. Engels didn't just keep Marx fed. He kept Marxism alive. And by doing so, he helped set the motion for the deadliest chain reaction in all of human history. A philosophy that was born out of poverty, resentment, and the cafes of Paris would one day lead to gulags, famines, re-education camps, genocide, killing fields. The most disturbing and horrible things in human history. Marx called himself the prophet of the worker, while Engels was the patron of the prophet, and together they gave the world ideas that would kill more human beings than any bullets, bombs, or armies ever could. Part 3. The Communist Manifesto. By the end of the late 1840s, Europe was in total chaos. There was a lack of food, a lack of jobs, unemployment was through the roof. The anger at the monarchies and the powers that be was untenable. From Paris to Berlin, the streets were filled with protests. Kings were fleeing their palaces, and revolution seemed like it was right around the corner. It was during this very pivotal moment in time that arguably the most devastating book in human history was written, the Communist Manifesto. Marx, with help of his friend Engels, published this bombshell of a book, and while it was only 30 pages long, that made it even more dangerous. It was quick, to the point, and easy to understand. No dense philosophy, no political correctness, just a clear call to arms. Marx famously said, "The history of all societies has been the history of class struggles. The oppressor and the oppressed stood in constant opposition, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." For Marx, this was destiny. The proletariat would rise, the bourgeois would fall, and history itself would march towards communism, the final solution. And yet, reality had other plans. Sure enough, in 1848, revolutions exploded all across Europe, and Marx fully expected his prophecy to finally unfold before his eyes. Instead, the uprisings fizzled out. People lost interest, and they feared for their own lives as the old regimes clawed back. to power. The kings returned, their armies crushed any rebellions, and Marx himself was expelled yet again. This time he was expelled from Belgium. Instead of becoming the father of a new world order, Marx was once again just a broke radical, packing his bags and living in his friend's basement rent-free. Even in his failure, the manifesto had already done the damage. The seeds had been planted. Those 30 pages would outlive every failed barricade, every king, even Karl Marx himself. And that is the real danger of Karl Marx. It's not during his lifetime, but what will come next. Part 4. The Death of a Philosopher. Fast forward to March 14th, 1883. Karl Marx died in London after years of sickness and living in poverty. He never lived to see his ideas take power. Only about a dozen people came to his funeral. His grave was simple and almost anonymous. He was as irrelevant as you could be. By most measures, he was a failure. Unpublished books, unfinished manuscripts, a legacy that was confined to very radical pamphlets, a small revolutionary circle. And yet, history was just getting started with him, his words, his ideas. Part 6. The Century of Blood. Fast forward to 1917, just 34 years after Marx's death. His followers and revolutionaries seized power in Russia, the Bolsheviks. They promised liberation. Instead, they delivered one of the most brutal famines, reigns of terror, and gulag systems where human suffering continues to ring to this day. In China, Mao Zedong raised the banner of Marxism. His great leap forward killed more people through starvation and forced labor than world wars. In Cambodia, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge slaughtered a quarter of the population in the name of Marxist purity. The list goes on. Cuba, North Korea, parts of Eastern Europe. Wherever Marx's ideas were tied, the pattern repeated itself over and over. The promise of equality always turned to dictatorship. The dreams of liberation always turned to mass imprisonment. The search for utopia always ended in starvation and mass graves of men, women, and children, or anyone who dared to go against the state. The death toll? Over 100 million lives in the 20th century alone. More than Hitler, more than any empire, more than any plague, and all of it traced back to this one basement dweller named Karl Marx. One unemployed intellectual stuck in a library, having his bills paid, telling the workers to unite while being unemployed. All of this man's theories led to destruction of humanity. One would imagine history would leave Marx behind and bury him forever. But you'd be wrong. His ghost still lingers on. His framework of the oppressors versus the oppressed, they'll tear down the institutions, abolish what came before. It's crawling back today. You hear echoes of Marx in the classroom all over the US, all over Europe. The protest slogans, the political manifestos, pitting groups against one another. The language has changed, but the logic is the same. The same ideas that filled gulags and mass graves, babies being hit against trees of Pol Pot, are now dressed in new clothes, repackaged to a new audience. Marx once wrote, "The point is not only to understand the world, but to change it." And in 2025, there are people trying to change the world using his playbook. Karl Marx died poor, alone, in exile in London, but his words, funded by Engels, forged in bitterness and evil, became the most destructive ideology in known human history. And now, 205 years after his birth, Marxism is crawling its way back once again, dressed in modern slogans, demanding the same revolution that has already cost the world a century worth of blood. This is Clueless and Curious, and today we've seen how one unemployed loser can reshape the entire world, and why his ideas still haunt us today.